Now let's take a look at this analogy question. The two words that are given to us are pain and sedative, and we have to figure out how these words are related and try to pick a pair with a similar relationship. Now, pain we all understand. A sedative is a substance that normally is used to relieve pain. It could also make you sleepy or make you a little bit calmer, but on the whole, the purpose of a sedative could be to relieve pain. So, the relationship is that a sedative relieves or reduces pain. Now, this is what we are going to work with. Please remember that we should not be changing the order. A says trance and narcotic. So, the relationship that we want is that a narcotic reduces a trance. The second reduces or relieves the first. But that's actually not true. A narcotic can cause a trance but does not relieve it. So, not the first option. B says stimulant and comfort. Now, stimulant is something that speeds up your system. It could possibly disrupt your comfort sometimes, but does not always reduce comfort. It could also produce a feeling of comfort depending on what you're taking it for. So, the relationship is not the same as sedative and pain. C says consolation and grief. Now, when you offer consolation to someone, you offer your sympathy, and sometimes that might reduce the other one's grief. So, in a way, we can say that consolation reduces grief, maybe not all the time, but again, we don't want it to happen all the time. We just are saying that it is possible that consolation can reduce grief, just like a sedative can reduce pain. Now, D is a very close option. Ache and extraction. Ache is pain, extraction is removal. So, let's think of a toothache. Sometimes when you have a toothache, you need to extract or remove the tooth. But what are you really doing? Are you trying to reduce the pain? No, you're trying to get rid of the pain entirely. So again, the relationship is somewhat close to sedative and pain, but it's not exactly the same, because extraction will completely remove the root cause of pain. It will not try to relieve it or reduce it necessarily. And the last one, voice and vibration. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but vibration of your vocal cords produces voice, and that is how we say that vibration is probably the cause of voice. But we definitely cannot say that vibration reduces or relieves voice. So our answer will have to be option C, because consolation relieves or reduces someone's grief. Now here we have a spelling question. Find the correctly spelt word. Of course, we need to know how to pronounce this word, because if you know that, then you probably also know how to spell it. So I will say the word out loud. The word is supposed to be pronounced lackadaisical. Lackadaisical. Now when you say it that way, clearly the first four letters are lack. We know how to spell this word. But if you know about this word, it means that you are lacking in enthusiasm or energy. For example, we could say, oh, this person has a lackadaisical attitude to everything. They don't really care about doing anything, or they lack energy, or they don't really show any enthusiasm for any task. That is what a lackadaisical or a casual attitude is. Now, this word is actually derived from an expression called lack-a-day. It's an old English expression. We don't really use it now, but it means regret or disappointment. Now, please remember this word, because it will help you remember the spelling. Lack obviously means the loss of something or the absence of something. You lack a day. So, you're kind of disappointed by the fact that you have lost time. So, when you have a lackadaisical attitude to something, it usually leads to some sort of feeling of regret or disappointment because the task was not really well done. Now, this is just a mnemonic. Here, we just need to ensure that we know the pronunciation and the correct spelling. So, let's take a look at our option. We have to have an A after lack, right? So, as far as I can see, option A starts off well, but I would probably pronounce it lackadaisical. So, that's not going to work. B is spelled wrongly from the beginning. There is no A after L. So, there's no way to really pronounce this word. C, lack is fine, but after that, we need to say a-daisical, lack-a-day. So, there is an A missing. D, lackadaisical is exactly what we want. And E has some extra E's thrown in, which we really don't want. So, our answer will have to be option D. Again, remember that if you struggle with spellings, try to figure out a way to remember that spelling instead of just trying to write it 25 times. So, if you remember lack-a-day, then it is easy to remember lackadaisical. Now, this is an odd one out question. It is very, very easy. we have to pick out the word that is different. And the words are, I'm going to read the options: morning glory, lily, rose, flowers, and marigold. If you know anything about flowers, you know that apart from one of the options, everything else is the name of a specific type of flower. So the odd one out obviously is going to be the generic word flowers, which is option D. Now here we're looking at a grammar question. A sentence is divided into 4 parts. We have to choose the part that is grammatically incorrect. Now this is a slightly weird question because you might have some trouble understanding what the sentence is trying to say, but the error is so clear. Those who want to do good are neither selfish nor in a hurry because they know what it requires a king. So by the time that you come to part number 3, you would realize that all of a sudden you're not very sure of what the sentence intends. They know what it requires a king. Now, if we just pause here, we should start thinking that normally we say, I know that, or they know that. So we definitely should not be using what. It should be that. But apart from that, why are we saying it requires a king? We could have said, they know that a king requires time. That would have made sense. But I would probably say that we can happily get rid of the expression a king and the sentence would still be correct. This is just one of the ways to correct it. So one of the ways is that part 3 should read something like this. They know that it requires. And after that we can happily continue with part 4. It requires time to impregnate people with good. Basically to spread good amongst people, or to inculcate good values or beliefs or whatever good we want to do amongst people. That's what the sentence is trying to say. But a king is absolutely unnecessary. But apart from that, obviously we say they know that and not they know what. So now we know that the error is definitely in part 3. But if you look at our options, part 3 is actually option A. So please make sure that you mark option A, which is part 3 of the sentence. Now here we have to pick out the synonym of the word unlawful. I thought this question was slightly complicated because there are some options which are very close. First of all, when we say unlawful, it obviously means something that is against the law or is not authorized by law. So the first option here is actually pretty close. When we say that something is illegitimate, for example, illegitimate business, it kind of means that it is not authorized by law or it does not really follow everything that laws require it to do. But illegitimate could also have a more generic meaning. It could mean not in accordance with accepted standards or rules. So we may not be breaking the law necessarily. We may not just adhere to certain ethical or social norms. That could also be illegitimate. For example, an illegitimate child is a child that is born out of wedlock. The parents of that child are not married to each other, and that is why that child is supposedly illegitimate, because we have not followed social norms. And that is why, even though option A comes very close, we would still be on the lookout for a better option, because illegitimate does not always mean unlawful. Now let's look at B. You have to be careful. This word is elicit. For example, I am trying to elicit a response from the students. It means to draw out or bring forth. I'm trying to get them to respond. But this has nothing to do with law. So can't be B. C says draw. Now draw has 2 meanings. One is when you make a figure, that's sort of a draw. But the other is also to attract or pull. So for example, if you're drawing someone towards you, you are attracting them. But again, nothing to do with law. So can't be C. D says illicit. Now the word illicit pretty much always means illegal. So probably this is our answer, but let's look at the last option as well. Nimbus. A nimbus is basically a cloud or a halo. So again, unrelated word. So if I were to be confused, I would be confused between options A and D. And since A could have other meanings, whereas D will pretty much always mean illegal, the better answer here is option D, illicit. Now here we have a very simple question. Choose the option closest to the meaning of the given idiom. Even if you're not familiar with the idiom, you could possibly figure it out. So for example, when we say, we talked shop at the office party, what are we doing? We are probably discussing work-related topics. That is what talking shop means. It doesn't mean that you're talking about online shopping. So let's take a look at our options. A says ridicule, but you're not really mocking anyone over here you're just talking about work, so not A. To talk about one's profession, yes, profession is equal to work and therefore could be B. To talk about shopping, this is probably an option that you might pick if you took the expression literally. But you have to understand that idioms are called idioms because you're not supposed to take them literally. You can't really take it at face value. There is some sort of a hidden meaning. And that is why I would be wary of choosing C. Treat lightly. When you talk shop, it does not really mean that you're not taking something seriously. You're just talking about work, so can't be D. To make fun of someone is equal to ridicule, which is option A, but we are not really making fun. There is nothing indicating that you're mocking anyone. So our answer would have to be option B. Now, of course, when it comes to idioms, a lot of times you either know or you don't know. But as I said, if you're somewhat careful, you could find your way to the correct option here. Here we have a spelling question, but this is a word that everyone should know. The word obviously is entrepreneur. This is a French word. Normally, we say that it is derived from the words entre and prendre. If you're familiar with French, entre sometimes means between or among, and prendre means to take. Now, how is this related to entrepreneurship? An entrepreneur is a person who starts and runs a business and therefore actually undertakes risk. And that is how it is related to prendre. You are taking the risk or assuming the risk of that business. Now, getting back to spelling, which is what we were supposed to do. Now, let's take a look at the options because that's what we were originally supposed to do. Obviously, the first option is incorrect because this I would probably pronounce entrepreneur. So, this is not going to be it. Option B is the correct one. C, this would be entra. So, this is a wrong pronunciation. D would also start off by saying entrepreneur. So, that can't be the answer. And E would be enter rather than entre. So, even if you know how to pronounce this word, you could probably figure out that your answer should be option B, entrepreneur. Of course, as I said, this is a word almost everyone knows. So, this should have been pretty easy for you. Now, here we have a seemingly grammar-based question, but actually it has to do with idioms. Which of the phrases given below the sentence should replace the word or phrase underlined to make it grammatically correct? So, the underlined phrase here is brushed her past. If you read the sentence, what it's trying to say is that Ria quickly passed by her without any sort of salutation, without really saying anything to her or greeting her. So, we want to say that Ria quickly passed her by or passed right next to her and probably kind of touched her in the process a little bit. So, A says brushed past. Now, we can say brushed past, but we normally indicate whom. Brush past someone is the correct idiom, and that is why it's not A. B says brushed past her. Now, her is the object of this idiom. Brushed past whom? Her. So, this is correct. C, brushed her. This would mean that someone is probably trying to use a hairbrush or some sort of a comb on someone else, but that's going to be a completely different activity. So, not C. Brushed her teeth, again, completely different activity. So, not our answer. So, our answer will have to be brushed past her because it means to come into contact with someone when you're passing them by, which is what probably happened in this situation. So, the answer is option B. Now, here we have some passage-based questions. The passage on its own is not very time-consuming, so we can read it very, very quickly. Look at the first two paragraphs. What these are talking about is a particular company called Vendora. Now, this company is an automaker, and this company wanted to gain dominance or a foothold in the US market. In order to do that, it resorted to certain unethical practices. What did it do? Look at the second paragraph. It rigged software that turned up dubious data in nearly 11 million vehicles. So, it created software that actually manipulated the data. The move cost the CEO his job, wiped off $24 billion in terms of market value and so on. So, it did cost the company, but the point is that the company had to pay because it had resorted to something very, very unethical. So, the main point we're trying to simply make is that this company tried to dominate the US market by cheating. And how did it cheat? It rigged software, and this software ultimately was implemented or probably used on millions of cars. So, it was a pretty significant amount of cheating. Let's move on and read what happened next. Now, here we are saying that the US has very stringent or strict fuel emission standards. Then it says, however, instead of conducting its own tests, it relies on automakers for data. So for example, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the concept of PUC. You have to get your vehicle tested, and there has to be some sort of certification that your vehicular emissions are within permissible limits, that your vehicle is not polluting excessively. Of course, it will pollute somewhat. Now here, we're trying to say that when an automaker creates a car and that vehicle has to be tested, who is supposed to do the testing? Normally, we would expect the government to do it, but surprisingly, that does not happen. The government relies on the automakers for data, and so you can see how Vendora was so easily able to cheat. India too follows a similar procedure. After that, however, it's saying that because of this episode, we probably need to rethink whether our lax or lenient testing norms were or are being exploited. So we need to look into the matter and make sure that we are also not being cheated. And ultimately, we're trying to say that since the number of vehicles is increasing, and in any case, our pollution levels are very high, we need to enforce somewhat stricter rules with regard to fuel emissions. So the point of this paragraph is to say that in the context of what happened, India needs to enforce stricter fuel emission norms. That's it. Now let's take a look at the last paragraph. Now here the author is giving some specific suggestions as to how we can enforce stricter fuel emission norms. For example, to reduce reliance on self-reported data, remember that we don't actually conduct the tests at governmental premises. The automaker is supposedly going to conduct the test and provide the data. So this we don't really want to do. So what should we do? We should get neutral third-party agencies with the necessary infrastructure. So instead of relying on the automaker who has every motive to cheat, we are looking at a third party. Apart from that, since we can't check every vehicle, we should conduct surprise tests just to make sure that whatever data is there is actually correct or accurate. And then we are saying that the European Union is taking steps in the context of this Vendora episode. Then the author is making some additional suggestions as to what we can do. For example, we need to maintain proper speed on the roads. Apart from that, try to decongest traffic-prone metros. So if you live in a big city, you know what we are talking about. And cheating should be dealt with severely. So in this paragraph, we're making some specific recommendations as to how we can probably enforce stricter fuel emission norms. Now we've understood the whole story. Let's take a look at the questions. The questions are actually pretty simple. The first one says, according to the passage, which move by Vendora deteriorated the image of the company? Now we know what Vendora did. It cheated, right? But how did it cheat? It rigged the software that provided inaccurate data on fuel emissions. So look at the second paragraph here. It rigged software. So what is this company trying to do? It's actually trying to manipulate the data to its own advantage, right? Now, if I look at option A, manipulating the data of vehicles sold over the years, rigging software is equal to manipulation. You are controlling or interfering with the data so that it is to your advantage, right? So probably A. B says playing with the data of vehicles. Now, the word playing could be used in multiple senses. If you play with the data, it could also mean that you are looking at that data from different perspectives, but the company is not playing with it. The company actually tried to structure the data so that it presents a rosier picture than it actually is. So option B should be eliminated because playing with the data is not an accurate representation of what Vendora did. C, hiding the data. The company actually did not hide. It provided the relevant data. It was just not accurate data. So not C. D says publishing the data. Yes, the data was published, but that is not why the company image suffered. It is because the published data was inaccurate, and that is why D is not our answer. E, auditing the data of vehicles. If the company had done this and done this honestly, probably the company's image had not deteriorated. But according to the passage, they tampered with the data, interfered with it. Nothing about auditing has been mentioned. So in any case, we should eliminate E. Our answer will have to be option A. As I said, very simple question if you look at the text. Now here also we have a very simple question. Vendora took advantage of which of the following factors? Now for this, we need to look at this part of the passage. The US implements stringent fuel emission standards, but instead of conducting its tests, it relies on automakers for data. Since Vendora was allowed to provide the data to the government, it was able to manipulate the data. So that is the answer to this question. Now let's take a look at our options. Lesser competition. Competition is not really the reason for Vendora's taking advantage. So what you have to understand is that yes, there was competition and therefore Vendora tried to cheat. But what allowed it to cheat is what this question is asking you. That has nothing to do with competition. So option A is eliminated. Stringent fuel emission norms. If in fact the fuel emission norms were even stricter, then Vendora may not have been able to cheat. So this is not what allowed it to cheat and therefore option B is gone. Lenient testing norms. Now lenient means relaxed. When you allow the automaker to provide you with the relevant data, then you are kind of relaxed about the process. So we keep C. D says government testing vehicles at their centers. This we know is absolutely untrue according to the passage. We don't conduct the tests at governmental facilities. We actually allow the automakers to give us the data. So eliminate D right away. Abundance of labor in the market. This is not mentioned anywhere in the passage. So eliminate E. Our answer will have to be option C, lenient testing norms. Now here, the question is asking us, according to the author of the passage, what can be the solution to enforce higher emission limits? Again, it's a fairly direct question. We just have to look at the paragraph in which the author is making specific suggestions. So, how can we enforce higher emission limits, or rather stricter emission limits is what the question should be asking. So, here we are trying to say that we need to reduce reliance on self-reported data. So, other companies should not be able to do what Vendora did. And so, in order to do that, let's get neutral third-party agencies with the necessary infrastructure to conduct these emission tests. Then the author recommends that even if we can't check every vehicle, we can do surprise checks and we can do audits. So, get third-party, do surprise checks and audits. These are the two suggestions that we need to keep in mind. Now, our first option says outsourcing the testing work to third-party neutral agencies having necessary infrastructure. This seems to be accurate, so let's keep A. B says the government doing testing of vehicles on its own. You see, we're not really trying to get the government to do the testing. The government can hire someone else to do it, as long as it is a neutral third party. So option B is eliminated. C, car makers doing testing of vehicles on its own. This is what we want to get rid of, because this is how Vendora was able to cheat. So definitely not C. D says the government should create an in-house team. I've inserted the "and." The government should create in-house team for testing vehicles. But the paragraph does not say that the government has to create its own facilities. The paragraph is saying let's get a third party to do the testing. So not D. Having necessary infrastructure in-house. This is very similar to D. So we can eliminate this as well. In-house means that the government should create its own infrastructure. But we don't want that. That's not necessary. So our answer will have to be option A. Now here, they're asking us, what does the author mean by the term industry-wide malpractice? I think this is self-explanatory in the sense that you don't really need to look at the passage. Nevertheless, let's take a look at that sentence in case it helps. Cheating should be dealt with severely to prevent it from becoming an industry-wide malpractice. So basically, we want to say that if someone cheats like Vendora does, then we need to punish them so that other people don't do it. That's the intention of this sentence. The first option says a few selected companies belonging to a particular industry following unethical practices. But that is not going to be equal to industry-wide. Industry-wide suggests that a lot of companies might be doing it. So option A can be eliminated because we are not talking about a few companies. B says most of the companies following unethical practices. This is what we want to avoid. We want to avoid other companies following suit in large numbers. If most of the automakers start doing this, then obviously our pollution levels are going to go out of control. So we keep B because it says most of the companies, which is somewhat similar to industry-wide. Now C again goes back to a single company. If a single company is following unethical practices, that is not industry-wide, that is then company-specific. So let's eliminate C. I think D could have been a confusing option for some of you. All the industries in India following unethical practices. So first of all the industries is not equal to industry-wide. We are actually talking about companies within an industry. So if you interpreted this option correctly, you would probably be able to eliminate D. We're not talking about all the industries, we're talking about companies within an industry. And E says some industries in India following unethical practices. This is again focusing on multiple industries, whereas we're talking about companies within an industry. So let's eliminate E. Our answer therefore will have to be option B. Now we're going to be dealing with a few passage-based questions. The good part about this passage is that it is short, but I believe 1 or 2 questions could have been confusing, where if you're in a hurry, you might mark the wrong answer. Now, in this passage, we're talking about the Indian middle class. The first paragraph is actually fairly tricky, which is why I have highlighted the sentences that you're supposed to be focusing on. The first sentence is saying that the Indian middle class has multiple strata. Strata are levels. And that is why we would not really expect it to be similar, but actually they are similar in one respect. So when the sentence starts with yet, this is going to be an important sentence. 2 paradoxical features characterize its conduct fairly uniformly, which means overall, people belonging to the middle class have these 2 features. Number 1, extensive practice and intense abhorrence or hatred of corruption. So why are they paradoxical? Because they are contradictory, right? People from the middle class are corrupt and they also hate corruption. Now, the second paragraph says that when you ask people who is generally corrupt, they will of course say that the top of the list is politicians. Politicians are the most corrupt people. But of course, after that, there are bureaucrats, policemen, lawyers, businessmen and others, and these people are part of the middle class. So the middle class is pretty corrupt, is what the second para is also saying. And then it says that teachers don't really figure high on this list, but it is not because teachers are very honest, but because they just don't have the opportunity to take money or bribes. So it's for lack of opportunity that teachers are not corrupt and teachers are also part of the middle class. After that, we're saying that the sense of shock over corruption in the middle class has actually declined, which means that we kind of now believe that the middle class is corrupt. Why is it corrupt? Because they want a better material life. They want more things. They want to buy more. And they don't really have the resources to buy more. So how do they buy more and more things? Obviously, they have to take bribes. The third paragraph again comes back to saying what is fascinating or interesting is the intense yearning of this class for a clean, corruptionless politics and society. So they are corrupt, but they still keep wanting a clean and corruption-free politics and society. And despite how many people have disappointed them, this yearning stays alive. So they don't give up despite disappointment. So as we can see, the first paragraph is simply trying to say that the Indian middle class is different, but similar in one respect. They are corrupt and they also hate corruption. Then the second para, despite all the information, is simply trying to establish that corruption is pretty widespread in the middle class. And the last paragraph is saying that the middle class still has an intense longing for a corruption-free society despite so many disappointments. So overall, if I have to think about the main idea, we're trying to say that the middle class is corrupt but still wants a corruption-free society. Alright, let's move on to the questions. Now the first one is seemingly very easy, but this is a tricky question. The Indian middle class is what? Now the first word here should actually be spelled differently. It is homogeneous or similar. Now look at the text. What we are trying to say is that there are many strata or levels in the middle class. So normally we would not expect homogeneity or similarity, but they actually are similar in one respect. So what we are really trying to highlight is that the middle class is similar in this particular way. And therefore, if I look at my options, the word homogeneous or similar actually will work. So I keep option A. B, defiant, not mentioned, so that is out. Mysterious, not mentioned, so that is out. So I can happily eliminate option B and C, no problem here. D is where we'll have a problem. Stratified. Stratified is kind of implied because it says that the Indian middle class consists of so many strata. But that is not the part that the author wants to focus on. And that is why we should not pick D. It is mentioned, but that is not the highlight of this paragraph. Ethical, definitely not, because it clearly says that they are corrupt. So I think option E is very easy to eliminate. So our answer is supposed to be option A, homogeneous or similar. Remember, the similarity is what the author is trying to highlight. So option A. Now let's take a look at this question. This is another fill in the blank. The question stem doesn't really make sense, but we can figure out what it is asking us. The intense middle class intensely yearns for. When you yearn for something, you really, really want it. So what does the middle class really want? Let's take a look. What is fascinating is the intense yearning of this class for a clean, corruption-less politics and society. So they want a corruption-free politics and society. Our answer is given to us. So A can definitely be the answer. B, we might have read about the fact that they want better material resources in the second paragraph, but this is not what they intensely want. What they intensely want is mentioned in the last paragraph, and therefore B should be eliminated. C, extensive practice of corruption. They are corrupt, but that's not what they want. They actually want to be corruption free. So C is out. Law of increasing returns has not been mentioned. It talks about diminishing returns, so we can eliminate D. They want a better lifestyle. Again, this has been mentioned in the second paragraph, but this is not their intense yearning. This is not what they really, really want. And so E must be eliminated. Since the answer is given to us directly, we should be easily able to say that option A is the correct choice. Now here we have another really simple question from the same passage. Teachers are not high on the list of corruption because they do not have. So let's take a look at the text. If teachers do not figure high on this priority list, remember the list is of the most corrupt individuals, yes? It is not for lack of trying. So teachers would have been corrupt, but they don't have opportunities. And so if I look at my options, it is obviously going to be option C. So I can easily eliminate everything else and directly go to option C. Very simple question. Now here again we have a very simple question from the same passage. Who figure on top of the list of corruption? Of course, if you look at the text here, it is very clear that on the top of the list of most corrupt individuals are politicians. And so if I scan the options, teachers would like to be corrupt but cannot be corrupt, so it's not A. Businessmen are also corrupt, but they are not more corrupt than politicians. So we eliminate B. For the same reason, we eliminate C also. D, politicians, of course, invariably and understandably are top of the list. So D probably is the answer. And E, policemen. Well, it does mention policemen, but they come after politicians. So eliminate E also. So our answer will have to be option D. There can be no confusion about this question at all. Now, here we have a somewhat complex passage. It's complex for two reasons. First of all, there are no paragraphs, and passages without paragraphs are usually a little difficult to read. Secondly, it uses terminology and it talks about things which we may or may not be familiar with, plus it throws in a lot of data. So what we're going to do is, we're going to break up that passage into two parts, and then we will try to understand what these two parts are saying. This is just for ease of understanding. There is no other reason whatsoever. The first part is trying to say that banks in Australia have a certain upside down quality to them. Now this is supposed to be a funny sentence because Australia is the land down under, okay? Everything there happens at a different time as compared to the rest of the world. So we're saying that, their banks are also kind of like that. Then we're saying that when the rest of the world was suffering in 2008, when there was a financial crisis, around that time, the banks in Australia were doing okay. They actually broke free from the drag. But now that the banks around the world are doing pretty well, the Australian banks are kind of suffering. And there is a reason why they're suffering. Look at the last bit. Investors fear that the exceptional circumstances underpinning or supporting the returns of recent years are coming to an end. So there was a reason that the Australian banks were doing well. First of all, there was a pretty strong domestic market. Apart from that, there was a commodity super cycle that boosted Australia and its banks, and unemployment is also increasing. So all that we're trying to say here is that the banks in Australia were thriving in recent years, but now they're facing multiple challenges. Weakening housing market, end of the commodity boom, and rising unemployment. So whatever had given them the boost is now seemingly coming to an end. Now let's look at the second half. Again, it was actually just one paragraph, but we've just broken it up so that we can read it easily. Now here, let's start with the first sentence and then we'll see how far we can get without getting confused. The biggest concern is the health of the bank's mortgage books. Now mortgage is basically housing loans. Home loans have been very lucrative in Australia, and because they were very lucrative for the banks, the home loans are actually a big part of the bank's portfolio. According to analysts, return on the top 50% would make even a pre-crisis Wall Street banker happy. So the returns on these housing loans were very, very good. As a result, the banks gave a lot of housing loans. After that, however, it's trying to say that a growing number of loans are now going to property speculators or to a homeowner paying only the interest. So on the whole, things are not doing so well in the housing market. And recent stress tests suggest that if the property goes for a toss, basically the property market goes bust, it will affect the banks severely. That is what the sentence means when it says recent stress tests suggested that the property downturn would ravage banks. Now there is a question about it later. So when you say that a downturn will ravage banks, it kind of means that the banks will be destroyed. So we need to prepare for that eventuality is what the regulators are trying to say. The regulators trot about the lack of diversification in banks. See, there might be a really good source of making money, and for the Australian banks it was housing loans. But if you put all your eggs in one basket, and if that basket is likely to fall, then the eggs will crack. I'm not going to stretch the analogy further, but the regulators are worried about the lack of diversification because the banks have given out so many loans and they're not really trying to make money from other sources. That is a cause for worry because the property market is not doing so well. Then it says that Australian banks may need as much as $40 billion in fresh capital to meet regulatory demands. So they need more cash. How are they supposed to get it? Apparently, we don't know. The big four banks in Australia are still profitable and their returns will still remain better than most. Aussie borrowers, Aussies are Australians, they are also less likely to default on mortgages than American ones. So it's trying to say, you know what, things are not as bad. The banks will still do okay, but there are reasons for concern. What are the reasons for concern? Credit growth is slowing. Expansion into the Asian market seems difficult, so there is very little scope for diversification. If the banks do not reduce their dependency on the housing loans, then regulators will have to find other ways to make the banks safer. See, the banks cannot collapse and the regulators are trying to ensure that they don't. So overall, the sum total of this part of the paragraph is to say that Australian banks are highly reliant on mortgages or housing loans, and because there is a property downturn, this is a risk for the bank. As a result, there are regulatory demands to infuse more capital so that the banks don't really run out of capital. Now, the story has come to an end. Let's take a look at the questions. Now here we have a very simple question. You don't really need to refer to the text to answer it, but just to be safe, we will take a look at it very quickly. Choose the word which is most nearly the opposite in meaning to the word dip as used in the passage. So in the passage, if you look at the highlighted word at the end, we're trying to say that concerns over balance sheets and exposure to Australia's housing market has caused their shares to dip. If there is a concern, the shares will fall. So dip probably means decline or fall. Now, if you're looking for an opposite, we are obviously going to look for a word that says rise or increase. Our options are very easy to work with. Option A says dry. Now, unless we are interpreting dip in the sense of taking a dip in a pool of water, this is not going to be relevant. It's neither similar nor opposite. Let's eliminate A. B, rise, is in fact the opposite of dip. The share prices are falling. The opposite would have been the share prices rising. So let's keep B. Decline is the same as dip, so this can't be our answer. Equal is not the same as dip. It's in fact very different from dip, so can't be D. Immense means a lot or intense or a huge magnitude of something. It is pretty much the opposite of dip, but in a very, very different way. Here, we are using the word dip in the sense of decline. So we need the opposite momentum, which is going to be increase or rise. Immense simply means having a large mass or a large quantity of something, but it doesn't really indicate the direction of movement. And that is why E cannot be our answer. So our answer would have to be option B. Now here we have a fact-based question for which you might find that you have to go back to the passage to check. So we will refer to the text to justify our answer. What does the passage convey regarding banks in Australia? In other words, which of the following is true about Australian banks? That's all we need to really do. The first option says Australian banks have a huge number of defaulters. This in fact is contradicted to some extent. Aussie borrowers are less likely to default on mortgages. So we don't know that the banks have a large number of defaulters. So this can be eliminated. Bank assets are heavily concentrated in the housing sector. This, in fact, is true. The biggest concern is the health of the bank's mortgage books. And if you look at the figures, it says home loans have been fabulously lucrative for Australian banks, but this is changing. And if you look at the last bit, no wonder then that domestic home loans now represent 40 to 60% of the Australian bank's assets. So we can definitely say that bank assets are concentrated in the housing sector. So let's keep B. C, Australian banks are safe and are growing from strength to strength. So we have mentioned on the whole that there are some reasons for concern. Why? Because if there is a property downturn, then it will devastate the banks. So we can't say that the Australian banks are safe. That is why the regulators are concerned about moving away from the housing market. So C is not true. Let's eliminate it. Australian banks have invested too heavily in property markets of other countries. In fact, again, this is not really stated anywhere, and later on the passage says that it has been difficult for the Australian banks to diversify in the Asian markets. So we can't say that they have invested heavily in the property markets of other countries. There's no support for this. And the last one says the 4 banks are in imminent danger of collapse. Imminent means it is bound to happen. Whereas if you look at the text, it says the big four banks are still highly profitable and their returns remain better. In case there is a property downturn, it is possible that the banking market might collapse. But that is not imminent, it is not bound to happen, and that is why E cannot be our answer. So we go back to B, and that is definitely the correct one. Now here we have a very easy vocabulary question. Choose the word which is most nearly the same in meaning to the word bumper as used in the passage. We've heard of the expression bumper crops, right? So when we have bumper crops, it means that there is a lot of production. So over here also, when we talk about bumper dividends, it means huge dividends, a large quantity, all right? Keeping that in mind, let's evaluate our options. A says adequate. Adequate is enough, but bumper means more than enough, plentiful. So A is not our answer. Now, the second option says buffer, right? So when we keep a buffer, it basically means that we are provisioning a little bit extra so that there are no problems. But buffer usually means provisions, extra. It does not actually mean bumper. Bumper is more than required. So buffer is generally something we dip into in times of need, whereas bumper is something that refers to having more than you need. So very different words, therefore B cannot be our answer. Frequent, well, when we say bumper dividends, we're actually focusing on the quantity or the amount of dividend. We're not really focusing on the frequency. So bumper does not refer to frequency. Therefore, not C. Impact does not mean either large or small or a significant or a trivial amount. So D is irrelevant. So it will have to be huge. Huge dividends will definitely work in the passage. And that is why E is our answer. Now here we seem to have repeated the same question, right? Except that the answer options have changed. What does the passage convey regarding banks in Australia? Again, fact-based question, we might have to refer to the text. Let's take a look at our first option. Australian banks have a surplus of capital according to regulators. This is not true. It says very clearly that a government inquiry into the Australian financial system called for banks to be better capitalized. They need more capital, as much as $40 billion in fresh capital to meet regulatory demands. So the regulators don't think that the banks have adequate capital. So let's get rid of A. Unemployment in Australia is on the rise. This is specifically mentioned right at the beginning. Unemployment is creeping up. This is one of the reasons that the banks might not be doing well. So let's keep B. C says regulators are unwilling to enforce strict reforms. But that doesn't seem to be true, because regulators are really on the bank's case about how they need to move away and diversify, move away from the housing market, because they're too reliant on the housing market. So look at the text here. They want banks to curb growth in the riskiest mortgages and to finance them with more equity and less debt. So regulators do want to reform the banks. So C is not correct. D, Australian banks are still struggling to recover from the 2008 crisis. At the beginning of the passage, it clearly says that their share prices, which refers to the share prices of the Australian banks, they broke free from the put that dragged their international rivals during the 2008 crisis. So the Australian banks were actually able to get out of the crisis. They were not as affected. They were doing well at a time that the rest of the world was not doing well. So D is definitely not true. It's contradicted by the passage. E says none of the options is true, but we know of course that option B is true. So we eliminate E and we say that option B is correct. Now here again we have a vocabulary based question. Choose the word which is most nearly the same in meaning to the word ravage as used in the passage. Now let's take a look at how ravage has been used. Recent stress tests suggest that a property downturn would ravage banks. So what I'm thinking is that since the banks are heavily reliant on the housing market, if this market does not do well, then the banks will be severely affected. In other words, they might be destroyed or devastated. So we're looking for words similar to this. Now let's look at A. A says invade and B says attack. Now you can see that these two options are very similar. And sometimes ravage kind of does mean to invade and attack and therefore destroy. But in this context, the banks are not being invaded or attacked, and therefore we can eliminate option A and option B. Steal. We're not saying that the property downturn will steal the banks. The banks are going to be adversely impacted, so we eliminate C. The property downturn cannot scam the banks. The banks are not being cheated out of anything, but they will be adversely affected. So let's eliminate D. So the only option that is left for us now is option E, which is the correct one. So the answer is E, devastate. Now here, we seem to have a multiple choice sort of a question. There are choices within choices. According to the passage, which of the following factors were responsible for the Australian economy's performance during the 2008 global crisis? If you remember, the Australian economy was able to recover and do well during that crisis. So what were the factors that led to the Australian banks thriving during the 2008 crisis? Let's take a look. It says very clearly that their share prices broke free from the put that dragged down their international rivals. In other words, the banks were not as affected, were able to get out of that vicious cycle. And then it says that the exceptional circumstances underpinning the returns of the recent years are coming to an end. So what are these factors that gave rise to exceptional returns? The commodity super cycle that boosted both Australia and its banks has fizzled. Unemployment is creeping up. So as far as I can see, it seems to be the commodity super cycle which was one of the factors that was giving the banks a boost. Now let's take a look at our options. A says Australian banks invested in American hedge funds. Now this has not been mentioned anywhere, so we can easily eliminate statement A. B says Australia inexperienced a commodity base. Now this option is very difficult to interpret, but at least it mentions commodities. So I'm thinking what it is trying to say is that there was a boost in the commodities market. So let's keep B. C says lack of investment in emerging markets. In fact, it doesn't mention whether Australia invested elsewhere or did not invest elsewhere. So C is out of scope, not really mentioned or implied. So the only one that we can work with is B, because only commodities have been mentioned in the passage. And since we have only B to work with, if I scan my options, I would have to say option A, which says only B. So this is your answer. You just need to be careful marking the options here. Now here we have a parajumble, except that there are really no options to work with. So in this way, this question is kind of similar to the kind of parajumbles we do in CAT. However, this is a very simple parajumble. Once you create the sequence, you can answer 3 questions at one go. Now, of course, you can answer them even without creating the entire sequence, but for convenience, let's just do that because it wouldn't really take you too long. So what we're going to do is, we're going to figure out what the starter is, as we usually do. The first sentence clearly is not the starter because it says the king was delighted. 2 says even though he was very rich, so this is not our starter. 3 again says everything he touched, so we don't know who the he is. And the 4th one says, one day he called his court magician. So far, we don't really know whom we are talking about until we read sentence 5. King Midas was a very greedy king. This seems to be a good starter and the beginning of the story. Let's look at the 6th one also. The 6th one says, the magician said. So before this, we would have to mention the magician. So once I know that 5th is my starter, I can build the rest of the sequence from here. King Midas was a very greedy king. Now there is one sentence here that elaborates on the king's greed. Look at sentence 2. Even though he was very rich, he always craved for more and more. So I should be able to connect 5 and 2. Now let's move on from there. Because he always craved more and more, One day, he called his court magician and commanded, "Find me a spell that can get me more treasures than I already have." So this is an outcome of the king's greed. So I should be able to link 2 and 4. So we're progressing at a very steady and very fast pace. Now, once he's commanded the magician is obviously going to talk to the king because he's received a command. So from 4, we can go to 6 because the magician in 6 is the same person who has been summoned by the king. The magician said, "Your Majesty, I can give you a power that no one else in this world has." So 4 and 6 are clearly linked. Now, since the magician has promised the king a special sort of a power, we should probably detail what that power is. So we go to 1. Anything you touch will turn into gold. The king was delighted with his good fortune. So we are able to link 6 and 1. Now, we come to the end of the story. Because the king now has this special power, the outcome of that will be 3. Everything he touched turned into gold. Now, if I put all of these together in a sequence, my sequence becomes 5, 2, 4, 6, 1, 3. Now, in the original question, all the sentences were numerically labeled, right? But when you look at the questions present the options alphabetically. So we have to convert these numbers into alphabets, which we will do for the next question here. So the question that was asked was, which of the following should be the third sentence after the rearrangement? So even if you figured out the first 3, it's very easy to do this. According to our sequence, 5, 2, 4, 6, 1, 3, which alphabetically becomes E, B, D, F, A, C, my third sentence should be D. If you remember, D is going to be option D, thankfully, so there is no confusion here. So I can now say that I know my answer to be D. Now let's move on to the next question based on the same parajumble sequence. So we're going to work with the same sequence here. Which of the following should be the 6th or the last sentence after the rearrangement? So what is the last in the sequence is what they're asking you. If you look at the sequence, clearly it is sentence 3 or sentence C. Now sentence C is actually option A. So here you could possibly make a mistake, but if you're careful, then you will say that it is option A, which is equal to sentence C. Now, this is probably the easiest question. Even if you didn't have time to form the entire sequence, you could still have answered this. Which of the following should be the first sentence after the rearrangement? Obviously, if you just figure out the starter, you would know that it would have to be sentence 5. Sentence 5 is equal to E. So, my answer will be option E, which is equal to sentence E.